Welcome to Headline Buster, brought to you by The Point with me, Liu Xin. In this segment, I'll dissect stories that are making headlines around the world and talk to my guests to compensate for the missing pieces of the puzzle. So join me in real time by sending us your comments or questions via the CGTN page on Twitter, Facebook, YouTube or Weibo. If you're watching this live on the CGTN application, email me at thepointwithlx@cgtn.com. Let me know what you think. We air the Headline Buster segment on Fridays at 11 a.m. Beijing time. Do get in touch and I just might read out your comments. This week we're going to talk about a tough topic, hate crimes against Asians. First, let's take a look at some viewer comments on this. By Bill 2018-03, it's a backlash. The Trump administration is accountable for the vicious spike. For elimination of such crimes, smearing and slandering China should be stopped. Unfortunately, Biden is still on Trump's track against China. From LYX24, how can a country with these many racial problems within its border has the guts of accusing other countries' human rights situation? It seems they don't even care about their own people's right. The basic human right is the right to live. Many thanks to these comments, and please keep them coming. So we get into today's topic. I'm not going to be busting any headlines today. Rather, I'll be looking at how the media is portraying the story and what they are saying about the factors fueling this spike. When did it all start and why? How much of a role have politicians played? And given all the red flag incidents we've seen since last year, why wasn't more done sooner? First, the news. A series of mass shootings occurred at 3 different spas in the area of Atlanta, Georgia on March the 16th. 8 people were killed and 1 wounded. The suspect, a 21-year-old white male, was taken into custody later that day, charged with 8 counts of murder. Despite the fact that 6 of the 8 victims were Asian women, local law enforcement hasn't called the mass shooting a hate crime, meaning a prejudice-motivated crime that targets someone because of their membership or perceived membership of a certain social group, religion or race. The local law enforcement spokesperson, Captain Jay Baker, offered his own insights into the crime, saying that the suspect was pretty much fed up and kind of at the end of his rope. Yesterday, he said, was a really bad day for him, and that's what he did. A sex addiction was suggested as the motive. When asked if the shooting might have been a hate crime, Atlanta Police Chief Rodney Bryan responded, "We're still early in this investigation, so we cannot make that determination at this moment." The responses have triggered a cascade of criticism. Some say the comments come across as justification for mass murder. Others say the allusion to the shooter's alleged sex addiction sounds like victim blaming. And yet others say the empathy shown for the shooter is one more example of white privilege and a systemic refusal to acknowledge that racism exists in American society. Many of these points were raised in a commentary piece from Rolling Stone called "The Excuse We Make for White Male Murderers." The article says the local law enforcement press conference inadvertently demonstrated the lengths to which people in this country will go to justify or even excuse the reprehensible actions of a white man, particularly one whose victims were marginalized members of society. The article adds that by telling the media that the attack did not appear to be racially motivated, the officer, intentionally or not, erased the complex and interlocking issues of racism and misogyny that could exist at the heart of the attack, and that by emphasizing that the victims allegedly tempted the shooter, law enforcement officials made the women complicit and were then also able to downplay any perceived racial biases behind the attack. By the way, no evidence has emerged that any of these victims were engaged in sex work. Even if they were, does that have anything to do with the value of their lives? Now, regardless of these debates, it would be a mistake to look at these cases as an isolated incident. Earlier in February, a shocking video showed a 91-year-old Asian man violently shoved to the ground in Oakland, California's Chinatown. In late January in San Francisco, an 84-year-old immigrant from Thailand was fatally assaulted and later died. In another case, a 75-year-old Chinese-American woman was punched on her face while waiting to cross a road, yet she managed to hit back at her attacker with a wooden stick. Now, according to police data released by the Center for the Study of Hate and Extremism at California State University in San Bernardino, although overall hate crimes in the 16 American cities profiled dropped by 7% in 2020, anti-Asian hate crime rose by 150%, and New York City saw a spike of 830%. Unfortunately, it's not just in the US. In the UK, figures from the London Metropolitan Police show over 200 incidents of hate crime against people of East Asian appearance reported just between June and September 2020, almost doubling year on year. In Australia, according to a poll by a think tank, 1/3 of the Chinese Australians said they have been called offensive names. Less than 1/5 said they have been physically threatened or attacked. In Canada, Vancouver police data shows anti-Asian hate crimes rose from a dozen in 2019 to 140 in 2020, an over 700% increase. The disturbing trend has got a lot of people asking why. Discrimination against Chinese in America is nothing new. In fact, it was institutionalized. The infamous Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882 prohibited all immigration of Chinese laborers to the US. It remains the only law to have been implemented to prevent all members of a specific ethnic group from immigrating to the United States. It wasn't repealed until 1943, when it was replaced with the Magnuson Act, which allowed 105 Chinese to enter the US per year. Chinese immigration later increased with the passage of the Immigration and Nationality Act of 1952, which abolished direct racial barriers. But the idea of yellow peril has been revived throughout different periods of U.S. history against Japanese Americans who were interned during World War II, for example. But what accounts for this recent spike in anti-Asian attacks? Well, one recent study published by the American Journal of Public Health found that former U.S. President Donald Trump's first China virus tweet on March the 16th last year was directly responsible for a major increase in anti-Asian hashtags. According to the report, before his tweet, the dominant hashtag on Twitter was COVID-19, but after his tweet, it was Chinese virus, which saw a surge in use of over 8,000%. And people who used that term were most likely to post other anti-Asian content. Many media headlines have picked up on the studies and stats and include important analysis on the real-world damage that political rhetoric can cause. For example, this Washington Post piece from March the 19th includes input from Russell June, a professor of Asian American Studies at San Francisco State University. The article says June argued that Trump's repeated use of the phrase Chinese virus had a direct correlation with a rise in hate crimes. It demonstrates how words matter, according to June. He added the term Chinese virus racializes the disease so that it's not simply biological but Chinese in nature, and stigmatizes the people so that Chinese are the disease carriers and the ones infecting others. Trump was reportedly still using the term China virus on Fox News the very night as the Atlanta spa shootings. The other question a lot of people are asking, why wasn't more done earlier? Now, Chinese-American journalist Connie Chun told CNN in an interview that the media has been miserably late in covering anti-Asian violence. We are insignificant, and it's so apparent to all of us who are Asian. It does make people wonder if the voices of the Asian group were louder or heard sooner. Would the situation have been different? Would there have been fewer attacks against people of Asian heritage? Could lives have been saved? If you take a quick look back at March 2020, after Trump started using the China virus slur, there were some pretty big red flags waving already, and yet the White House defended Trump's position, calling the criticism surrounding the term fake outrage. A New York Times article from March the 18th last year was entitled "Trump Defends Using Chinese Virus Label, Ignoring Growing Criticism." It's not racist at all, the president was quoted as saying. The article adds, but the term has angered Chinese officials and a wide range of critics, and China experts say labeling the virus that way will only ratchet up tensions between the two countries while resulting in the kind of xenophobia that American leaders should discourage. Asian Americans have reported incidents of racial slurs and physical abuse because of the Iranians' perception that China is the cause of the virus. So the question becomes even more chilling. There were actual signs that and statistics that such crimes were already rising after Trump started using racial slurs. And yet, here we are a year later with discrimination and crimes against Asians still spiking. The UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres said in a recent statement that thousands of incidents across the past year have perpetuated a centuries-long history of intolerance, stereotyping, scapegoating, exploitation and abuse. In a cartoon published by our network CGTN days ago, the Statue of Liberty asked an American kid what she wants to be when she grows up. The kid, with dark hair and an Asian appearance, replied, "I don't know, but I know what I don't want to be. Asian," she wrote down. In countries as diverse as the US, all ethnic groups are promised the right to live with equality and dignity, but until influential people speak and act responsibly, these will remain only concepts on paper. Making sense of the overwhelming wave of information means cutting through the noise to shine a light on the heart of the story and making room for new perspectives. True understanding means the ability to see events from more than one side. I'm Liu Xin, and this is The Point. Welcome back to Headline Buster, brought to you by The Point with me, Liu Xin. I'm pleased to be joined from Ottawa, Canada by Professor Chen Xiaobei from the Department of Sociology and Anthropology of Carleton University, Canada. From San Francisco, Andy Young, Vice President of Fujian in the Bay. And from Tokyo, Associate Professor Lim Tai Wei, Senior Research Fellow Adjunct from the National University of Singapore. Welcome to all of you. Let me go to Professor Chen first, and later to Mr. Young. From your personal experience, have you personally encountered any abusive language or physical attacks over the past year? How close to home is this topic to you?
Well, thank you for having me. I want to say that in the past year, I've been doing teaching mostly at home online. So I have not personally encountered abusive language. I want to say, though, that it's also problematic to only focus on hate crimes and hate incidents on the streets, because racism is a much larger issue. The media report so far has been only focused on attacks, but racism actually affects people in many levels, and many of these problems are quite invisible. For example, when there is the scapegoating narrative circulating in our society. In Canada, for example, the one effect could be this question: who do you work for? So Chinese Canadians will be automatically suspected that you have divided loyalty, that you may be working for the Chinese government. Now that kind of problems often may not be voiced. From my perspective, I think we should also talk more about systemic racism rather than only focus on hate crimes. Yeah. It's a very narrow focus.
Okay, we will expand to that. Let me go to Mr. Young, your personal experience over the past year.
So over the past year, I've have a small business in San Francisco. I have a small restaurant, and my restaurant was vandalized 4 times within the year. So ever since March till February of this year. And as a kid growing up in the project, I was one of the few Chinese kids who made out of the hood. Anyways, I just want to stick to the subject. My restaurant was vandalized 4 times, and it was it was totally heartbreaking, especially during COVID. We were struggling to keep our
Right.
business afloat.
And I would definitely not imagine that this is the kind of rate of damage or crime that's inflicted on your restaurant before COVID erupted, right? I mean, things must have not been like this, Mr. Yang.
Right. Yeah, because I've been running my business at the McAllister Street of San Francisco for the past 6 years, and then
The past year
might
was
happen
particularly
once.
bad.
Yeah, I mean, might happen once for the past 4 years, but not like last year. It was nearly every 3 months we'll have a break-in, we'll have a
Wow.
vandalism, people smash the window and attack the restaurant and whatnot.
Wow. We'll talk a bit more about that. Yeah, both of you so far have raised very important points. But Professor Lim, let me go to you. You live in Asia. Do you also have this kind of experience, or you are more or less observing what's happening in other parts of the world?
Yes, I have lived in many countries over the past few decades. And fortunately, I have not faced personal incidents at all. However, I do approach the subject matter from an academic perspective. And throughout the world history, one of the courses that I taught, racism has always been a consistent theme and thematic subject matter that is rather prominent in human societies and history. And therefore, as an educator, one thing that I notice is that many societies have different coping mechanisms in order to mitigate and handle racism. But they do have one denominator in place. It is a common denominator in which all nations can work together as a non-detrimental factor, which is to combat racism. And therefore, you can see that it is a theme that is raised in the United Nations, part of the sustainability development goals.
Yes.
And together, I think that this is a great opportunity for countries to work together, particularly since we live in a very globalized world where there's a lot of movements of people, whether it's migrants or for jobs or for many other reasons. And I think this is a great opportunity, particularly since also that after the pandemic, we are going to see a lot of economic dislocations.
Yeah.
And one of the fallout from the economic dislocations would be racism, in which you scapegoating or blaming others for economic ills.
Okay.
So this is a good chance for all countries to work together.
Absolutely, that's why we're talking. Unfortunately, it's taken so much damage to the Asian community for this to become a hot topic. But Professor Chen, what do you think are the forces driving the spike of racism, either visible or invisible, against Asian communities?
We need to understand that it is specifically targeting Chinese. Unfortunately, East Asian Canadians and Americans got attacked too because they look like Chinese. With that in mind, I think certainly the geopolitical tensions between China and the US and to some extent the West is very much the background that cannot be excluded from understanding this right hostility against the Chinese and against East Asia.
Andy, what is your take on this question? Yeah, what do you think? What do you think has really driven these people to break into your restaurant again and again, and why people of other minorities are actually doing this more than the white people? To you, in particular, your group.
First of all, I feel like getting back to the question is there's like an economic disparity, and also we have a lack of leadership and lack of representation from the media because the Western media, for years they've been downplayed and they portrayed us in certain way. We are deemed to be inferior, submissive, and passive. So that kind of gives a pathway to a lot of criminals, to take advantage of the fact that, everything is predetermined. When you see a Chinese person walking down the street, especially they're preying on the old and weak now. So we are the young generation of Chinese America here in San Francisco. I feel like over the past 200 years, we've been deemed as inferior and, easy to pick on. It has to change. And this is not the first time that's been happening to our community. It's only when someone who happened to be white shot up Atlanta and killed 8 people, and then 6 of them happened to be Asian, and then that made it to the national headline. But this has been going for the past 200 years. This has been going for the 20 years of my life here in the city of San Francisco. Constant breakdowns, constant robberies, and constant assault on our elderlies in the community is getting out of control. So what contributes to the hatred, I feel like it partially has to do with Donald Trump's antagonizing rhetoric towards China, labeled COVID as Kung flu and China virus, and partially has to do with the unemployment rate. Daniel D. came when he had the Congress hearing. He specifically stated that Asians are statistically insignificant when it comes to voting.
Wow.
Meaning, our vote doesn't really count when it comes to politics. And we're getting schooled by both the left and the right, because you got to understand how the mainstream media are controlled by the left here. All the fake news for years, ever since I stepped my foot on the U.S. soil, they started making a lot of, falsifying and making a lot of false accusations about China. And that's something that's been institutionalized. And before I finish my statement, I'd like to bring an example. My mentor, Z-Man, that's my big homie. I took him to China for the first time, 2019. And he was appalled how his misconceptions and misperceptions about China, it was how contradicting it was. It was like a mind-blowing experience for him. So anyway,
it shows the role of the media as well in not informing people comprehensively and adequately. We have some viewer comment here. I'm going to bring that in and see what the viewer has been saying to our conversation. So from Jay in New Zealand, I think the racism is fueled by intergenerational trauma, and I think it will continue because it justifies the disgusting reasons they attack the weak, and it's historically entrenched in America culture. Professor Lim, any comment?
Yes, I think racism has been a very long part of a very long history of humankind. And in every society, there have been incidents of racism. And coming from ASEAN, I'm glad to say that the region celebrates diversity. You can see that the ASEAN comes together, 10 different countries. Each country has a plethora of races, ethnicities, and religion. And they have made it a point. They're not perfect, but they have made it a point to have a harmonious coexistence, to be able to celebrate diversity, the different cultures that bring color as well as innovation to economics, cultural diversity, and many other spheres of life.
Professor Lim, just a moment. I'm going to bring up this cartoon, which is very relevant and very interesting as well. It's by the comedian and host of the satirical talk show by Trevor Noah. The picture says, white guy, shoots and kills 8 people. Media says alleged shooter was Coldplay fan or lover of fine wines. Andy, let me get your take first. Well, how do you look at, what is he trying to say, and does it resonate with you?
Well, it doesn't resonate with me in a certain way. I feel like what he's trying to say is he's being satirical about the situation, how white supremacy does exist in our society, and how they are trying to downplay the seriousness of his atrocity committed in our community.
Yeah, time is really limited. I'm going to give each and every one of you the opportunity to give your suggestion. What do you think is the most urgent thing that has to be done in order to address this problem? Professor Lim first.
Okay, just now you made a popular cultural reference in the example, and I feel that popular cultural references can be a force for good, especially in the social media generation. So this is an opportunity in the social media sphere as well as popular cultural industry for the conservatives and the progressives to work together to combat racism together. Thank you.
Andy?
So, as closing, I'd like to encourage everyone. It doesn't matter which party you support. If you are Asian, if you are Chinese, we must come together as one because only together we stand and we have the strength to carry on, to reach out to more people. We want to show them the strength. And on March 27th, we are hosting one of the biggest rally here in San Francisco. We're going to march down from City Hall all the way down to Union Square. We are projecting about 5,000 people turn out. It's going to be one of the historical Asian civil rights movement. So I just want to encourage more young people to get out there, stand up and speak up in the face of racism, in the face of injustice. You know, the perpetrators and the racists, they come in all colors and shapes. So please, when you see something, do something. When you see something, say something. Never worry about the consequences. I'm not saying you don't have to evaluate the environment, but the time has changed now.
Okay.
We are together as one. We are let go of all of our disputes and differences.
Okay,
Yeah.
Professor Chen.
I think Asian Americans and Asian Canadians need to find our own voice, and we need to dare to speak up. So in Ottawa right now, we are organizing a vigil to protest against the anti-Asian racism and the anti-women violence. This is a political action among many that we are taking to call attention to these problems, to make Canada a better place for everyone.
Yeah. Well, many thanks to my three guests, Chen Xiaobei, Professor Chen Xiaobei joining us from Ottawa, Canada, Andy Yang joining us from San Francisco, and Professor Lim Tai Wei joining us from Tokyo. And with that, we come to the end of this edition of Headline Buster. I hope that this issue will be in the spotlight for some time to come so that we can keep the pressure on so that the situation can have the opportunity to be redressed. Many thanks for following this edition of Headline Buster. You've got the point, and thanks for watching.